Snow had buried the entire valley. Not the rooftops, not the chimneys, not the tall, proud church the town had been so certain of. All of it, gone beneath the white. And somewhere down there, under all that frozen silence, people were still breathing, trapped in the dark, running out of wood, running out of air, running out of hope. But high above the drowned valley, one window still glowed, one house still stood. The only house they had all laughed at. A woman stood at that window, gray and weathered, looking down at the white grave where a whole town used to be. The people who had mocked her, shunned her, called her a fool, and now they were the ones waiting to be saved. She reached for the rope, and she began to climb down into the cold. But to understand that rope, the cold, the long climb down toward the very people who had once cast her out, you have to go back before the snow, back before the silence ever swallowed the valley whole, back to a time when that same woman was nothing in the eyes of the town but a joke, because it began the way so many cruel things begin. It began with laughter. Years before that terrible winter, when the valley was still loud and golden with greed, a couple arrived on a single wagon pulled by a tired bay horse named Ash. The man was tall, weathered, quiet. His hands were the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime shaping stone. The woman beside him was near the end of her 50s. Her name was Cora Aldridge. Once, long ago, she had been a school teacher, a woman of chalk and books and gentle order. Now her eyes carried something deeper, something patient, something that had learned to survive. They came to a mining town tucked into a narrow valley where the mountains rose so high they seemed to hold up the sky itself, and the town was burning with fever, not sickness, but silver. Everywhere she looked, men chased the dream of sudden riches. Wagons crowded the single muddy street. Saloons spilled noise into the night. Every patch of flat ground had already been claimed, fenced, fought over, sold. The valley floor belonged to the powerful, and the powerful had no room for dreamers. Cora climbed down from the wagon and looked around at the chaos, at the mud, at the men shouting prices, at the hunger in every face. Then she lifted her gaze, higher, past the rooftops, past the smoke, up to the great sandstone cliffs that walled the valley on both sides. Sheer, ancient, towering. The kind of stone that had stood long before any man arrived, and would stand long after every man was gone. Her husband followed her eyes. "You're looking up again," he said softly. "I'm always looking up," she answered. "That's where the future is." He smiled at that. He had heard her say strange things before. After all these years, he had learned that her strange things were usually right. But this time, even he hesitated. Because what she pointed to was not land. It was a wall, high on the southern cliff, perhaps the height of several houses stacked one upon another. There was a deep, natural shelf in the rock. A great stone overhang jutted out above it, like a roof carved by time itself. A narrow trail, barely wider than a goat's path, twisted up to reach it. To everyone else in that town, it was worthless. To Cora Aldridge, it was home. They went to the land office the next morning. The clerk was a thin, bored man who had grown rich watching desperate people pay too much for too little. When the couple told him what they wanted, he laughed. He thought it was a joke. "You want to buy The cliff? He asked. The bare rock? Nobody can live up there. Nobody but the birds. We can, Cora said. The clerk leaned back, studying her. He saw the gray in her hair, the worn coat, the calm, certain way she held herself, and he assumed the worst. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "if money's the trouble, there are cheaper plots down by the creek. No shame in starting small." Cora's expression did not change. Here was the thing the clerk did not understand. The thing none of them understood. It was not poverty that drove her to the cliff. It was vision. For years, in the quiet of long evenings, she had read about the people who came before. Ancient builders, lost to time, who had once carved their homes directly into living rock. They did not fight the land. They did not build upon it, only to watch the wind tear it down. They built within it, with it, as part of it. And their homes had outlasted entire civilizations. Cora had never forgotten that. So when she pointed to the cliff, she was not pointing to a desperate last choice. She was pointing to an idea that men had forgotten how to dream. The claim cost almost nothing. No one else wanted it. The clerk shook his head as he stamped the papers. "Living like a bird," he muttered. "I give you 1 winter." Cora took the papers, folded them gently, and tucked them away. "1 winter," she repeated. "We'll see what the winter teaches." Word traveled fast in a town with nothing better to talk about. By that very evening, the strange couple on the cliff had become the favorite joke of every saloon and supper table. A man and his wife, meaning to live in a hole in the rock, like swallows in a mud nest, perched above the town, watching the world go by like a pair of foolish old birds. And the loudest laughter of all came from a man named Gideon Marsh. Marsh was the richest man in the valley. He had not found his fortune in the ground. He had found it in other men's desperation, buying land cheap and selling it dear. He was building himself a grand house at the head of the valley. 3 full stories of imported timber. Glass windows hauled in from far away at terrible cost. A wide veranda that looked down over the town like a throne overlooking its kingdom. He wanted everyone to see it. He wanted everyone to envy it. And he could not tolerate the idea that anyone might choose to live differently. "So," Marsh announced, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "we have ourselves a pair of cliff swallows now." The men around him roared. "One good frost," Marsh went on, raising his glass, "and they'll come crawling down that goat path, begging for a proper roof. Mark my words." He laughed until his face turned red. The name stuck. The Swallow's Nest. That was what they called it now. Cora heard the whispers when she came to town for supplies. She saw the smirks, the pity, the way the women turned their shoulders just slightly, just enough, so she would understand she was not welcome among them. She carried it the way she carried everything, with a straight back and a quiet heart. That night, by a small fire beneath the great stone overhang that would one day be her front door, she sat beside her husband and looked out at the lights of the town below. So many lights, so much noise, so much certainty that they were right, and she was a fool. "They're laughing at us," her husband said, not bitter, just honest. Cora watched the firelight dance against the ancient rock above them. rock that had waited 1,000 years for someone to finally understand it. "Let them laugh," she said softly. "The stone doesn't hear them, and neither will I." Her husband studied her in the orange glow. He knew that look. He had followed that look across half a country. "You really believe this will work?" he said. It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. "I believe," she said slowly, "that everyone down there is building against the mountain. And the mountain always wins." She turned to face him. "We're not going to fight it, Thad. We're going to ask it to keep us." And in the silence that followed, the wind moved through the canyon, low and ancient, like a voice that had been waiting a very long time to be heard. Far below, the town glittered on, drunk on silver and certainty. None of them knew what was coming. None of them could have known that one winter, not this one, and not the next, but one winter still hidden in the years ahead, the sky would open, and the snow would fall, and it would not stop. It would bury the laughter. It would bury the grand houses. It would bury everything those men were so sure of. And the only thing left standing, the only shelter in a drowned white world, would be the swallow's nest. But that winter was still far away. For now, there was only a woman, a man, a tired horse, and a wall of stone that everyone said was worthless. And a dream that the whole valley laughed at. She picked up a chisel that night and held it in her weathered hand. Then she pressed it to the rock and made the first mark. The first of 1,000. The first of 10,000. The beginning of something that would outlast them all. The work began the way all true things begin. Slowly, quietly, without anyone watching. Each morning, before the sun had even cleared the eastern peaks, the woman climbed the narrow trail with a basket of tools on her arm. Her husband walked ahead, leading Ash, the old horse carrying timber and water and iron up the winding path. And each morning, the cliff was waiting for them, patient, silent, enormous. The first marks Cora made in the stone were clumsy. The chisel slipped, the hammer struck wrong, and the shock of it ran all the ways up her arm and into her teeth. Her hands, soft from a lifetime of holding chalk and turning the pages of books, were not made for this kind of labor. The rock did not care. It met her softness with its hardness, and it won, again and again. By the end of the first week, her palms were torn open. Blisters rose, broke, bled, and rose again. At night, she could barely close her fingers around a spoon. She would sit by the fire and stare at her own ruined hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Thad watched her wrap them in strips of cloth by the firelight. "You don't have to do this part," he said gently. "I can carve. You can keep the camp." She looked at him with something soft and stubborn in her eyes. "This is my dream," she said. "I am not going to watch it from the side." So she kept carving. And slowly, so slowly, she did not notice the day it happened, her hands began to change. The blisters hardened into calluses. The calluses became strength. Where once there had been the gentle hands of a teacher, now there were the hands of a builder. She would look at them sometimes in the evening light, turning them over, hardly recognizing them. These were not the hands she had carried through her whole life. These were the hands of the woman she was becoming. The dwelling grew the way a tree grows, not all at once, But ring by ring, day by day, stone by patient stone, first came the main chamber, hollowed back into the soft sandstone beneath the great overhang. Thad knew stone the way a musician knows a melody. He could press his palm flat against the cliff and somehow understand where it would split clean and where it would crumble into ruin. "The rock tells you," he said once, his voice low, "if you are quiet enough to listen." Cora learned to listen too. She learned to read the grain, to mix the mortar until it was just right, not too wet, not too dry, to fit one stone against another so tightly that no wind could ever find its way between them. And as they worked, she began to imagine the rooms not as they were, bare and raw and unfinished, but as they would one day be. Here, a hearth, where the fire would glow on winter nights. Here, a window facing south to catch the low and golden winter sun. Here, deep in the cool back of the rock, a place to keep food through the longest, hardest season. She saw it all in her mind, complete and warm and full of life. And that picture pulled her forward, even on the days when her whole body ached and her spirit wavered and the trail home felt steeper than it had the morning before. Because the picture was not just a house. The picture was a promise she had made to someone, a very long time ago. There are wounds that never fully close. People learn to live around them. They build their days carefully, the way a person walks carefully around a hole in the floor of an old house. They forget it is there. And then one ordinary moment, they step wrong, and they remember everything. Cora had such a wound. It came to her one evening, near the end of a long day, when the light turned gold, and the canyon went quiet and still. She was sitting on a flat stone, resting, looking out over the valley far below. And a small bird, a little brown thing, quick and bright, landed near her feet. It tilted its head. It looked at her with one black eye, and then it was gone, lifting into the fading sky. And just like that, the woman was somewhere else, somewhere far back in the years, in another house, in another time. There had been a child, a little girl. She had been born when Cora was young, in the early days of the marriage, when everything still felt possible, and the future was a wide and open road. A daughter with bright eyes and small quick hands who used to chase the birds across the yard and laugh when they flew away from her. They had named her after a bird themselves, Wren. Such a small word, such an enormous love, but the world is not always gentle with the things we love most. A fever came one cold season. It came quietly, the way the worst things always do. And it did not leave. The little girl who chased birds slipped away before the spring ever came. And something in Cora went with her. For a long time afterward, she could not speak of it. She could barely speak at all. The house they had lived in became unbearable. Every corner of it haunted by a small shadow that was no longer there. The empty chair at the table, the little shoes by the door, the silence where laughter used to be. People told her the things people always say. That time would heal it. That she was still young. That there could be other children in time. But there were no other children. That door had closed when the fever passed. The chance was gone, just as the girl was gone. And so the woman carried a double grief, the child she had lost, and all the children she would never have, For years, she lived inside that grief like a house with the curtains drawn against the daylight. She went through the motions of a life. She taught her lessons. She kept her home. She smiled when smiling was expected of her. But a part of her had gone quiet, the way a room goes quiet after a song ends. And then, one evening, in the worn pages of an old book, she read about the ancient builders, the vanished people who had carved their homes into the living rock, homes that had stood for 1,000 years and more, long after the hands that made them had turned to dust. Something stirred in her that had been still for a very long time. These people were gone, every single one of them. Their names, their faces, their songs, all of it lost to the silence of the years. And yet, they were not entirely gone, because the thing they had made still stood, still sheltered, still spoke across the centuries to a grieving woman who would never know who they were. They had built something that outlasted death itself. And Cora understood, in that quiet moment, what she had been missing all along. She could not bring back the child. She could not undo the fever or unlock the door that grief had sealed. No power on earth could give her that. But she could build something lasting, something strong, something that would still be standing long after she herself was gone. A home that would hold life and shelter and warmth for people she would never even meet. If she could not give the world her daughter, then she would give the world a home that would never fall. That was the secret reason she pointed to the cliff. Not poverty, not foolishness, not the strange whim of an aging woman as the town believed. It was love, a love that had nowhere left to go. So it went into the stone. She never told the townspeople this. They would not have understood, and she would not have wanted them to. They saw only a couple living like birds on a ledge, a pair of old fools too stubborn to come down. They could not see the grief that the dwelling was built to hold. They could not see that every blow of the hammer was a word in a long, silent letter to a little girl who used to chase birds across a yard in another life. But Thad knew. Thad always knew. And on the evening the little brown bird landed at her feet and lifted away, he came and sat beside her on the flat stone. And he did not say anything at all. He simply took her torn and calloused hand in his. And together they watched the sky go dark over the valley that did not understand them. The town, meanwhile, had not stopped talking. If anything, the talk had grown crueler with each passing season. When supplies ran low, Cora had to come down into the valley to buy flour and salt and nails. And every time she walked that single muddy street, she felt the eyes on her, following her, measuring her, finding her strange. The men smirked behind their hands. The shopkeepers overcharged her, just slightly, just enough to remind her that she was not one of them and never would be. But it was the women who cut the deepest. They had a way of going silent when she entered a room, a way of drawing their skirts aside as she passed, as though her strangeness might be catching, like a fever. A way of speaking just loudly enough for her to hear, while pretending she could not. There she goes, the bird woman. Living up in that hole, can you imagine at her age? You would think she would want comfort, a real home, a real life, something to show for all her years. And at the center of them all stood Mrs. Adelaide Marsh. The rich man's wife was a tall, polished woman with cold eyes and a colder smile. She wore the finest dresses in the valley, ordered from far away at great expense, and she made certain that everyone noticed them. She ruled the women of the town the way her husband ruled the men, through money, through fear, through the constant quiet threat of her disapproval, which could turn a person into an outcast with a single raised eyebrow, and she had decided that Cora Aldridge was beneath her. One afternoon, the cruelty found its sharpest edge. Cora had come into the general store, tired and dusty, her hands wrapped in their familiar cloth, her hair gone gray and wild from the wind on the cliff. A small group of women stood near the counter, Adelaide Marsh among them like a queen among her court. The room went quiet, the way it always did when the bird woman entered. And then Adelaide spoke, not to Cora, about her, as if she were not standing right there, close enough to touch. "My husband says they will be gone by the first hard freeze," Adelaide said, smoothing the fine leather of her gloves. "Personally, I think it is rather sad. A woman her age, with nothing to show for her whole life but a cave in the rock, no children, no proper home, nothing but that ridiculous little nest." The other women tittered behind their hands. "Some people," Adelaide went on, her voice light and sweet as poison, "simply never learned how to live." The word hung in the air of the quiet store. Children. Of all the cruel things she could have reached for, Adelaide Marsh had reached, without even knowing it, into the deepest wound the woman carried in all the world. No children. Cora stood very still. She did not answer. She did not flinch. She paid for her flour. She gathered her things into her basket, slowly, carefully, and she walked out of the store with her back straight and her chin level and her face as calm as still water. She did not let them see, but the trail up to the cliff was long that day, and steep, and somewhere on that climb, in the cold blue shadow of the great rock, the woman who never wept. She sank down on the trail. The basket tipped, and the flour spilled white across the stone, and she did not even reach to save it. She let it come, all of it, the grief and the loneliness and the long years of being looked at like something broken and pitiful. No children, no proper home, nothing but that ridiculous nest. The words went round and round in her mind, and each time they came back, they cut a little deeper. She had crossed half a country chasing a dream. She had torn her hands open on the rock until they bled. She had buried a daughter and sealed away her grief, and tried so hard for so long to turn her pain into something that mattered. And to the world below, she was only a foolish old woman in a cave. For one long, dark moment, the woman thought about giving up. She thought about the warmth of an ordinary house, the kindness of ordinary neighbors, a quiet life among people who did not whisper when she passed and did not draw their skirts aside. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was a fool. Maybe the mountain would never keep her after all, and she would die up there on that ledge, alone and laughed at, with nothing finished and nothing proven. She did not hear Thad come up the trail behind her. She only felt his hand on her shoulder, warm and steady. And then he was kneeling beside her in the dirt, gathering the spilled flour with his careful hands, his weathered face full of a tenderness that had not faded in all their long years together. "They said it again," he said quietly. "It was not a question. Cora nodded. She could not yet trust her voice. "The thing about Wren," he said, "about no children." She nodded again. The tears came fresh, and she let them. Thad sat down beside her in the dust of the trail, in no hurry at all. He did not rush to fix it. He did not tell her to stop crying or to be strong. He had learned, long ago, that grief is not a problem to be solved with the right words. It is a weight to be carried. And the only true mercy is to carry it together, in silence, until it eases on its own. "You know what I think," he said at last. She shook her head. "I think," he said slowly, choosing each word, "that woman down there has 3 children and a house full of fine things she did not make. And she has never once built anything with her own 2 hands. She has never made a single thing in her whole life that will outlast her." He took Cora's wrapped and calloused hand and held it up gently between them in the cold mountain light. "But you," he said, "look at what these hands are making." Cora looked at her own hands. "That woman thinks you have nothing," Thad went on, his voice low and sure. "But she is wrong. She is so wrong it would be funny if it did not hurt you so much. You have a thing she will never have. You have a purpose that is bigger than yourself." He nodded up at the great stone overhang where the half-finished dwelling waited in the deep shadow. "That is not a cave, Cora. That is a promise, yours and mine. And it is going to keep its promise long after every cruel word in that town has been forgotten, and the people who said them are dust." The woman looked up at the cliff, at the rooms slowly taking shape in the rock, at the patient work of their hands, at the dream that the whole valley laughed at. And slowly, very slowly, something steadied inside her. The grief did not leave. It never would. But it found its place again. It settled back into the old wound it had come from, and the woman was able to breathe. She wiped her eyes with the back of her ruined hand and let out a long, shaking breath. "They are going to be very surprised someday," she said. Thad smiled, the lines deepening around his eyes. "Yes," he said, "I believe they are." And together they gathered what flour they could save, and they climbed the rest of the way up the trail back to the work that was waiting for them in the rock. But hardship, once it begins, rarely arrives alone. The seasons turned and the dwelling grew, but so did the troubles that came with it. The money they had brought with them began to run thin. Stone was free, given by the mountain, but everything else had a price. Timber for the window frames, glass for the panes, iron for the hinges and the rings and the tools that wore down and needed replacing, salt and flour and feed for the horse. The valley merchants, who had no love for the bird people, did not offer them any kindness in their prices. There came a day when Thad counted out their coins on a flat rock, and the two of them looked down at the small, sad pile in a long silence. It was not enough. Not nearly enough to finish what they had started. "We could stop," Thad said carefully after a while. "Wait a season, earn a little. There is work down in the town for a man who knows stone the way I do." But they both knew exactly what that meant. It meant walking back down into the valley every single day. It meant working for the very men who mocked them over their suppers. It meant building grand houses for the rich, while their own dreams sat half-finished and coiled up on the cliff, waiting, fading. Cora looked at the small pile of coins for a long moment. Then she looked up at the dwelling. "How much more do we need?" she asked quietly. "Less than you would think," Thad admitted, "but more than we have." The woman was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the canyon. Somewhere far below, a dog barked, and the sound floated up thin and small. Then she reached up and touched the small gold band on her finger, the one thing of true value she still owned in all the world. The ring he had given her in another life, when they were young, before the little girl who chased birds had ever been born. "No," Thad said immediately, understanding at once. "Not that. Anything but that." "It is metal," she said softly. "It is just metal, Thad. The thing it means that does not live on my finger." She pressed her hand flat to her chest, over her heart. "It lives here. It always has." "Cora." "The house is the marriage now," she said, and her voice was gentle but certain. "Don't you see? Every stone we set is a vow. Every wall we raise is a promise kept. Let the ring become the door. Let it hold us the way it always meant to." And so the gold band that had bound them together for a lifetime was traded away for the iron and the glass and the nails that would finish the swallow's nest. It should have been a sad thing. By every measure of the world below, it was a tragedy. A woman selling her wedding ring for a hole in a cliff. But somehow, it was not sad at all, because she was right. The ring had only ever been a symbol of something larger, and now the symbol would become something real, something a person could walk through, something that would stand against the wind and shelter strangers from the cold. Down in the valley, when word of it got out, the laughter turned vicious. "She sold her own wedding ring," Gideon Marsh crowed at the assay office where the men gathered to weigh their fortunes. "For a hole in the rock, the old fool. I tell you, they will not last the winter. Mark me on it. They will be gone or frozen by spring, and the cliff will have its empty nest back." The men laughed and slapped the counter. The bets were placed, coins changing hands on how soon the bird people would break. One winter, they all agreed on it. One winter, and the dream would be over. The first winter came, and here is the cruel joke that the mountain played on them all. It was mild. Oh, the snow fell. The wind blew down from the high peaks. The nights grew long and bitterly cold. But it was a gentle season, as winters in that high country went. The kind of winter the old-timers would barely remember, because nothing about it was worth the remembering. For the people of the valley, it was an easy season. They burned their cordwood by the stove. They stuffed rags into the gaps of their plank walls. They grumbled about the cold and waited for spring. And spring came right on time, and they forgot all about it by summer. For Cora and Thad, high on the cliff in their half-finished home, the mild winter was something else entirely. It was a verdict that proved nothing at all. Their stone walls held the warmth through the long nights. Their south-facing window caught the low sun and let it pour like honey across the floor. And the floor gave the heat back slowly through the dark hours. A small fire kept the chamber comfortable. They were not cold. They did not suffer. They were, in truth, more comfortable than half the families down in the valley. The dwelling worked, but who could say so? The winter had been gentle. Any house could survive a gentle winter. The plank shacks in the valley had survived it. Marsh's grand mansion had survived it, drafty as it was. There was no proof. There was no triumph. There was no great vindication. There was only the quiet, deflating truth that nothing had been settled at all. And in the gray, thawing weeks at the ragged edge of spring, something happened that had never happened before in all their years. Cora began to doubt. It crept in slowly, the way doubt always does, not all at once, just a little colder each day. She would look at the dwelling and no longer see the promise in it. She would see only the rough stone, the unfinished corners, the strange and lonely thing she had poured her hope and her ring and her torn hands into. She would look down at the valley, at the smoke rising warm and ordinary from the houses, and she would wonder, what if they were right? What if the mountain never tested the house at all? What if she lived out her remaining years up here on this cold ledge, the foolish bird woman, and nothing ever came of it but more whispers, more pity, more long mornings alone with her grief and her aching hands? What if the dream had been nothing but grief wearing a prettier face? One gray evening, she said it out loud for the first time. Maybe Marsh is right. Thad looked up sharply from the fire. In all their years, in all their hardship, she had never once said such a thing. "You don't mean that," he said. "Maybe I do." Her voice was tired in a way that frightened him more than tears would have. "We sold the ring, Thad. We have torn ourselves to pieces on this rock for season after season. And for what? A mild winter that proved nothing to anyone. They are all down there laughing, and maybe, just maybe, they are laughing because they are right." She stared into the flames. Maybe some dreams are just a way of running from the things you cannot fix. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the canyon, low and endless. And for once, it was the woman who had lost her faith, the woman who had carried the vision all this way, who now could not find it in the dark. But here is the quiet gift of a long marriage. It does not ask both people to be strong at the very same time. When one falls, the other stands. And then, when the time comes, and it always comes, they trade the weight between them. For so long, Cora had been the one who believed. She had carried the vision up the trail every single morning. She had stood straight under the cruelty of the town. She had turned her own wedding ring into a door without a moment of hesitation. She had held the faith for both of them all this way. Now it was Thad's turn to hold it for her. He set down the bit of wood he had been whittling. He crossed to where she sat by the fire, and he knelt before her on the cold stone floor. And he took both of her ruined hands in his own. "Listen to me," he said, and there was something in his voice, low and certain, that made her finally look up. "I have spent my whole life with stone," he said. "I knew it before I ever knew you. And I am telling you something now, not as your husband, but as a man who understands rock better than he understands anything else in this world." He held her eyes and would not let them go. "This house is right." She tried to look away. He would not allow it. "That mild winter did not prove anything to them down there," he said, "but it proved something to me. I felt it, Cora. On the coldest night of the whole season, I put my bare hand against that back wall, deep in the heart of the rock, and it was warm. Not from our little fire, from the mountain itself. The mountain was keeping us, just exactly like you said it would all those seasons ago." His voice dropped lower, steadier. "The valley got lucky this year. That is all that happened. The mountain was not even trying. And one of these years, maybe not soon, But someday, it is going to try. It is going to come down on this valley with everything it has. And on that day, every one of those proud houses down there is going to learn what the two of us already know." He pressed her open hand flat against his chest, over his heart, so she could feel it beating. "You believed when I had my doubts, back at the very start. You believed enough for the both of us when I could not see it. So let me believe now. Let me carry it for a while. That is what this is for. That is what we are for." The woman looked at her husband, at his weathered, certain face, at the steady faith burning in his eyes, faith as solid as the stone he had given his life to. And slowly, the cold thing inside her began to thaw at the edges. She did not become certain again. Not that night. True certainty would come later, in a way that none of them, not Cora, not Thad, not a single soul in that laughing valley, could yet imagine. But she stopped sinking. She held on to him, and he held on to the faith. And together, between the two of them, they kept the dream alive through the long gray edge of that first uncertain spring. "All right," she whispered at last, against his shoulder. "All right, we finish it." Thad smiled, and the firelight caught it and held it. "We finish it," he agreed. And so they did. Through the thaw and into the warm months, they worked harder than they ever had before. The doubt did not vanish all at once, but it changed. It became fuel. Every stone set was now an argument against the laughter in the valley. Every window fitted was a quiet, stubborn act of faith. The main chamber was finished, smooth and warm and dry, the firelight dancing on its carved stone walls. The bedroom took shape beside it, carved deep into the cool, quiet heart of the rock. A third space, connected by a short passage, was hollowed out for storage and for Ash, who would stand warm and dry through any winter the mountain could ever think to send. A spring was found, seeping pure and cold straight through the sandstone, so that even water would never fail them in their high home. The door was hung at last. The window glass, bought with the price of a wedding ring, caught the morning light and threw it golden across the smooth stone floor. And one ordinary evening, near the close of a long and weary day, the woman stepped back and looked at what their two pairs of hands had made together. It was modest. It would never impress a single soul in the valley below. It had no 3 stories, no grand veranda, no imported glass and gleaming polished timber, but it was beautiful. It looked as though it had grown straight from the cliff itself, as though it had always been there, waiting patiently through 10,000 years for someone to finally arrive and come home to it. It was finished, and it was theirs. Cora rested her calloused hand against the door frame, the door that had once been a ring upon her finger, and she felt the warmth still living in the stone from the day's last sun. She thought of Wren. She thought of the little girl who used to chase birds across a yard, and the promise she had made in the long silence of her grief. Something lasting, something strong, something that would shelter life long after she herself was gone from the world. "There," she said softly, to the child no one else could see. "I made it. I made it for you." The wind moved through the canyon, low and ancient and for once almost gentle. And far below, in their warm and ordinary houses, the people of the valley slept on, certain of everything, knowing nothing at all. They had laughed for a season. They did not know that the mountain had not yet begun to speak, but it would. Oh, it would. And when it finally did, only one house in all that wide valley would be standing to listen. The years that followed were kind, not easy. The mountain was never easy, but kind, in the way a stern teacher can be kind, asking much and giving much in return. The seasons turned, one into the next, and the dwelling in the cliff held through every one of them. The winters came and went. Some were colder than others. The snow piled deep in the valley, and the wind howled down from the peaks like something hunting in the dark. But up in the swallow's nest, the woman and her husband stayed warm and dry and safe. The stone kept its promise, and slowly the laughter in the valley began to fade, not into respect, not yet, but into a kind of puzzled silence. The bird people had not frozen. They had not come crawling down the trail, begging for a proper roof over their heads. They had simply gone on living, season after season, in the home that everyone had sworn could not possibly last. It was strange. It did not fit the story the town had told itself, so the town mostly stopped telling it. There were even those, here and there, who began to look up at the cliff with something other than mockery. A young couple, newly married and poor, who could not afford the valley land. An old miner whose lungs could no longer take the cold of his drafty shack. They looked up at the warm glow in the high window on a winter night, and they wondered. They did not say anything. Not yet. To speak well of the bird people was to invite the scorn of Gideon Marsh. But they wondered, and wonder, like a seed, has a way of waiting in the dark until its season comes. Marsh himself, of course, never stopped mocking. His pride would not allow it. "Give it time," he would say, waving his thick hand. "One bad winter, and they will learn. They will come down that trail on their knees." But there was something thinner in his voice now. The certainty had begun to crack, just a little, like ice at the edge of a pond when the sun first touches it. He did not like the way the cliff dwelling sat up there, year after year, above his head. He did not like what it seemed to be saying without saying anything at all. He did not like being wrong. And deep down, in a place he would never admit to a living soul, he was beginning to wonder if he was. The woman, meanwhile, had found something she had not felt in a very long time: peace. She woke each morning to the sun coming gold through the south window, spilling across the smooth stone floor. She tended her small things. She kept the fire. She fed the old horse, Ash, who had gone gray at the muzzle now, but still nickered softly when she came near. She watched the valley below, the comings and goings, the smoke from the chimneys, the slow and steady turning of the year. The grief was still with her. It always would be. But it had become a quiet companion now, walking beside her, not a wound that bled. The house had given her that. The promise kept had given her that. She would sit in the evenings and run her hand along the smooth stone of the wall, the stone she had carved with her own hands, and she would think of all the years it would stand, long after she herself was gone from the world. It was enough. For a while, it was enough. But the mountain was not finished with them yet. One autumn, near the close of the warm season, a stranger came up the trail. He was an old man, older than anyone in the valley could rightly say. His face was weathered like the cliffs themselves, brown and cracked and deep. carved by more winters than a body should be able to survive. And his eyes were pale and far away, as though they were always looking at something just over the edge of the horizon, something no one else could see. He was a wanderer, one of those few who still drifted through the high country, belonging to no town, owing nothing to anyone, carrying his whole life on his back, and asking nothing of the world but the room to keep walking through it. He stopped at the foot of the trail and looked up at the dwelling in the cliff for a long, long time. Then, slowly, he climbed. Cora met him at the door. She did not know him. She had never seen his face before. But she had learned in her years on the mountain that a stranger at the door was to be fed, not feared. So she gave him bread. She gave him cold, clear water from the spring that seeped through the rock. She let him sit by the fire and warm his old, tired bones. The wanderer ate slowly, the way a man eats when he has learned not to trust that there will be more. He did not say much. He looked around at the carved stone walls, at the warmth held deep in the rock, at the way the whole house seemed not to sit upon the mountain but to grow out of it, as natural as the cliff itself. And something passed over his weathered face, something like recognition, something almost like reverence. "You built with the rock," he said at last. "Not against it." "My husband did," Cora said. "We both did." The old man nodded slowly. "The old ones built this way," he said. "Long before your people ever came to these mountains, they knew the land. They did not fight it. They did not try to conquer it. They let it keep them, the way a mother keeps a child." He looked at her then with those pale, far-away eyes. "You know this already," he said. "I can see that you know it. It is in the way you carry yourself. You have made your peace with the mountain." Cora said nothing, but something in her chest went still and listening. The wanderer finished his bread. He brushed the crumbs from his coat. He stood, slow and careful, and went to the door and looked out over the valley below, at the little town with its plank houses and its single muddy street, at the grand mansion at the head of the valley with its 3 proud stories and its glass windows catching the last of the autumn light. And his face changed. The peace went out of it. Something old and grave came in. "This winter," he said quietly, "will not be like the others." Cora came and stood beside him at the door. "How do you know?" she asked. The old man was silent for a long moment. The wind moved through the canyon below them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and certain, and it sent a cold thread winding down her spine. "The animals know," he said. "They always know first. The elk came down from the high places too early this year, long before they ever should have. They are not waiting for the cold to come. They are already running from it." He lifted one gnarled finger toward the trees on the far slope. "The squirrels gather like creatures gone mad, twice what they need for an ordinary season, 3 times, as though they know they will not see the bare ground again for a very, very long time." He turned to look at her, full on. "And the woolly caterpillars," he said, "black from one end to the other. Not a single band of brown on them. Not this year. In all my years, I have seen it only twice before, and both times." He did not finish. He did not have to. Cora felt the cold thread pull tight around her heart. "The signs all say the same thing," the wanderer went on. "Every one of them. This winter, the sky is going to open, and once it opens, it will not close again for a long, long time. He looked back out at the valley, at the warm and ordinary houses, at the smoke rising lazy from the chimneys, at all the people down there who knew nothing, suspected nothing, prepared for nothing. This is the kind of winter, he said softly, that separates the living from the dead. And then he gathered his few things, and he thanked her gravely for the bread and the water and the warmth of her fire. And he went back down the long trail and out into the high country, and the gathering dusk swallowed him whole. She never saw him again. But his words stayed. His words stayed, and they grew, the way a seed grows in dark and silent soil, slowly, certainly, where no one can see it. She told Thad that night, by the fire. He listened in silence, his weathered face unreadable in the orange glow. He did not laugh. He did not wave it away. He had lived too long with stone and sky and the long patience of the mountain to laugh at an old man who could read the animals. "Could be nothing," he said at last when she had finished. "Old wanderers see signs in everything. A man walks alone that long, he starts hearing voices in the wind." "Could be," Cora agreed quietly, but she did not believe it. And neither, she could plainly see, did he. "What do you want to do?" Thad asked. The woman looked into the fire for a long, long time. The flames danced, the shadows moved on the carved stone walls, and when she finally answered, her voice was steady and sure, the way it had been at the very beginning, on the day she first lifted her hand and pointed to the bare cliff. "We prepare," she said, "for the worst winter anyone has ever seen. And we pray every night that the old man was wrong." So they prepared. All through the last warm weeks of the autumn, the woman and her husband worked the way they had worked at the very beginning, with that same fierce and patient purpose. They carved new storage spaces deep into the cool, dry heart of the rock, and then they filled them. Dried meat hung in careful rows, preserved vegetables sealed against the air, flour and salt and coffee, enough to last, not for weeks, but for months, enough for 2 people to live on through a season that had no end at all. "You are preparing for a siege," Thad said one afternoon, leaning on his tools, watching her stack the last of the provisions with her strong, careful hands. Cora did not smile. "I am preparing for winter," she said. "In the mountains, those are the same thing." But she did more than store food. She did something else. Something even Thad did not fully understand at the time. She had him drive iron rings deep into the face of the cliff. Strong ones, anchored hard into the solid rock, above the door and below it, and out along the ledge, points where a rope could be tied and would hold the full weight of a grown person, swinging free. Thad set the last ring with a final ring of the hammer, and he wiped his brow, and he looked at her. "Why?" he asked. "Why all of these? We do not climb. We have the trail." The woman did not have an answer she could put into plain words, only a feeling, a heaviness in her chest, a sense of something coming on the wind, something that would ask far more of the two of them than mere survival. "In case we ever need to go down," she said slowly. "When the snow is too deep for the trail." She looked out over the valley, at the little houses, at the chimneys, at all the people down there who were not preparing for anything at all, who were laughing at her even now. "In case," she said again, softer this time, almost to herself, "Someone ever needs us to come down for them." Thad followed her gaze down to the valley, and he understood then fully what he had only half understood before. His wife was not only thinking of the two of them. She had never, in all these years, been only thinking of the two of them. Down in the valley, no one prepared for anything. The silver was still flowing out of the mountain. The money was still good. The autumn stayed mild and golden, day after lovely day, and the idea of a terrible killing winter seemed as far off and unreal as a ghost story told to frightened children around a fire. So when word got around that the bird woman was storing food like a creature gone half mad, that her husband was driving iron rings into the bare cliff for no reason anyone could understand, the town found the whole thing very funny indeed. "The old fools think the sky is falling," Marsh announced at the assay office, and the men gathered there laughed along with him the way they always did. But here is a thing worth knowing about Gideon Marsh, a thing the town never saw, because he never, ever let them see it. One evening, near the very end of that golden autumn, the woman had business down in the valley, and her path home took her past the grand mansion at the head of the valley. The light was failing. The lamps inside had not yet been lit, and through the wide front window, she saw something she was never meant to see. She saw Gideon Marsh alone. He did not know that anyone was watching, and so, for once in his life, he was not performing. He was not playing the rich man, the proud man, the man who had beaten the world. He was just a man. He stood in the very center of his great parlor, surrounded by all his fine imported things, his polished timber and his costly glass, and his furniture brought from 1,000 miles away. And he was not proud. He was not laughing. He was small. He stood there in the gathering dark, a man surrounded by everything he owned in the world, and he looked utterly, achingly lost in the middle of it. His shoulders were bent, his head was low, and his face, when she caught a glimpse of it through the glass, was tired and frightened and old, in a way she would never in her life have imagined a man like Gideon Marsh could be. And in that quiet moment, the woman understood something about him that she had never understood before. The grand house was not pride. It was fear. A man does not build 3 full stories of imported timber only to show the world how rich he has become. Not truly. Not deep down. He builds it to convince himself. He piles up wall after wall, window after window, room after costly room, to put something solid between himself and a thing he is terrified of. And the woman, who knew a very great deal about the heavy things that people carry in silence, understood at last exactly what Gideon Marsh was so afraid of. He was afraid of being poor again. Somewhere, far back in his life, in a place he never spoke of to anyone, Gideon Marsh had known hunger. Real hunger. He had known the cold. He had known what it was to have nothing at all, and to be looked at by the world the way the town now looked at the bird woman, with pity, with scorn, with that turning away of the eyes. And he had spent every single year since then building a fortress against that memory, a great fortress of money and timber and contempt, aimed at anyone who dared to remind him of where he had truly come from. That was why he hated the swallow's nest so much. Not because it was foolish. Not really. Because it was poor, and it was unafraid, both at the very same time. Because Cora Aldridge had almost nothing in the eyes of the world, and yet she was not ashamed. She walked through that town with her back straight and her chin level, owning nothing, fearing nothing. And that frightened Gideon Marsh more than any storm ever could. The woman stood in the failing autumn light and looked at the lost and frightened man in the window of his great empty house. And she found, to her own surprise, that she did not hate him any more. She pitied him. She walked on home up the long and winding trail to the cliff, and she said nothing of what she had seen to anyone, not even to Thad. Some things a person simply keeps. Some understandings are too heavy and too private to be carried by more than one heart. But she carried it with her after that night, and it would matter in the end. It would matter far more than she could ever have known. The winter came on the wind. It began the way any winter begins. A heavy snow, a hard, cold wind. The people of the valley pulled their coats a little tighter and stoked their stoves a little higher and thought nothing more of it. But the snow did not stop. The first day it fell thick and steady, and the valley turned white and soft and silent and lovely. The second day it fell harder, faster, and the wind began to scream down from the high peaks like something with a living voice. A voice full of rage. The third day, the drifts began to climb, past the bottoms of the doors, past the lower windows, and still the sky poured down its endless white, hour after hour after hour, with no break, no mercy, no end anywhere in sight. By the fourth day, the people of the valley had stopped laughing. By the fifth day, they had stopped going outside at all. The snow pressed hard against the plank walls. It climbed the houses like a slow, rising white tide. It buried the muddy street, the fences, the wagons, the whole familiar world. And the wind never once stopped, driving more and more snow down from the peaks, faster than anyone would ever have believed possible. By the seventh day, the lower floors of the houses had vanished completely beneath the white. By the ninth, only the chimneys and the very peaks of the roofs still showed above the surface of the snow. And inside their buried homes, the people of the valley began to understand, far, far too late, exactly what the strange old wanderer had meant. This was the kind of winter that separates the living from the dead. They huddled around their stoves in the dim, smoky light. Their firewood dwindled fast, far faster than any of them had planned, because not one of them had planned for a winter with no end. The snow climbed up and over the chimneys, choking back the smoke, until families had to make a terrible choice: freeze in the cold, or suffocate slowly in their own homes. It was a nightmare. A slow, white, silent, smothering nightmare. And the grand mansion at the head of the valley fared the very worst of all. 3 stories meant 3 full stories of surface for the snow to push and press against. The imported timbers, cut and shaped for a far gentler place 1,000 miles away, had never once been meant to bear weight like this. They began to groan in the long nights, to crack, to shift and shudder in the dark. And on one terrible night, deep in the very heart of the endless storm, the great north wall of Gideon Marsh's proud mansion finally gave way. It did not fall slowly. It came down all at once, with a roar that was swallowed up instantly by the deadening snow, burying the grand parlor under tons of crushing white, the fine timber, the costly glass, the furniture brought from far away at such terrible expense, all of it gone in a single moment beneath the patient weight of the mountain. Marsh and his family fled to the only room still standing. They huddled there together in the freezing dark, the rich man and his polished wife and their 3 frightened children. And for the first time in his entire life, all of Gideon Marsh's money could not buy him a single thing that he needed. He had built his great fortress against being poor and cold and afraid. And now he was all 3 at once. And the fortress itself was crushing him. High above the drowned and dying valley, in the swallow's nest, the woman and her husband watched it all. Their dwelling did not groan. It did not crack. It did not shift or shudder in the night. The great stone overhang sent the falling snow tumbling down well in front of their door, so that no white tide could ever climb and press against their entrance. The solid cliff at their backs blocked the worst of the screaming wind. And the south window, even now, even in all of this, still caught what pale gray light managed to filter down through the endless clouds. The stone behind them never once grew cold. Deep in the rock, the mountain held its ancient, patient warmth, the way it had held it for 10,000 years and more, and it shared that warmth freely with the 2 souls who had been wise enough and humble enough to ask for it. They were warm, they were dry, they were safe, and they were not laughing, because from their high window they could see the whole of it laid out below, the buried houses, the chimneys with their thin, failing, dying wisps of smoke, the terrible empty space where the grand mansion had stood so proud, its great wall gone now, swallowed whole by the white. They could see the valley dying. On the 7th day of the storm, the woman stood at her window and looked out at the endless white that had swallowed the entire world below. "There are children down there," she said softly. Her breath fogged the cold glass. "Families. They are freezing, Thad. They are running out of wood. They are running out of air." Her husband came and stood beside her at the window. His voice, when he spoke, was very low. "I know," he said. The woman pressed her open hand flat against the cold glass. The glass that had once, long ago, been a wedding ring upon her finger, and she thought of the iron rings driven deep into the face of the cliff, the ones that no one had understood, the ones she had insisted upon that last autumn for a reason she could never quite put into words. In case someone ever needs us to come down for them. She had known. Some part of her, deep down, in that quiet place that read the world the way the old wanderer read the animals, had known all along that this day would surely come. "When the storm breaks," she said quietly. And it was not a question, not at all. "We go down." Thad turned and looked at her, at his wife, gray-haired and calloused and certain, standing at the window of the house that the whole valley had laughed at, looking down now at the very people who had laughed the loudest and the longest, the people who had shunned her, pitied her, drawn their fine skirts aside as she passed, called her a foolish old woman with nothing in the world to show for her long life, the people she was now quietly, calmly preparing to climb down a frozen cliff face to save. "When the storm breaks," he agreed, and outside the snow kept falling, soft and white and endless, burying the laughter and the grand houses and every last thing the valley had once been so very sure of. Only one house in all that white and frozen world was still standing. Only one window still glowed, warm and gold, with light and life. And behind that window, a woman waited, patient as the stone itself, for the sky to finally close, so that she could go down into the ruins and begin to save the very people who had cast her out. The storm broke on the morning of the 12th day. It did not break slowly. One moment, the wind was still screaming down from the peaks, the way it had screamed for nearly 2 weeks without rest. And then it simply stopped. The silence that followed was enormous. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a world that had finally finished falling. The woman woke to it, to the absence of the wind. She had grown so used to that howling that its sudden end felt louder than any sound. She rose from her bed in the warm heart of the rock, and she went to the south window, and she looked out. And what she saw stole the breath from her chest. The sun had come out. It hung low and brilliant over a world that no longer looked like the world at all. The valley was gone, utterly gone. There was no town, no street, no houses, no grand mansion at the head of the valley. There was only white, an endless, blinding, frozen white, smooth and unbroken, like the surface of some strange and silent moon. It rolled from one canyon wall to the other, swallowing everything that had ever stood there, and here and there, poking up through that vast white silence, were the tops of chimneys, thin, dark, lonely, like grave markers in a field of snow. The woman stood very still and looked at them, and she understood that beneath each one of those chimneys, somewhere down in the cold and the dark, there might still be people, buried, trapped, waiting, or already gone. "Thad," she said quietly. Her husband was already awake, already standing, already pulling on his heavy coat. "I see it," he said. She turned from the window. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. They were the same eyes that had pointed to the cliff so long ago. The eyes of a woman who had made up her mind. "It is time," she said. He nodded. "It is time." And so they prepared to climb down into the ruins. This was the moment the iron rings had been waiting for. The rings no one had understood. The rings Marsh had laughed at. The rings she had insisted upon that last autumn, for a reason she could never name. Now she knew the reason. Now everyone would know. Thad tied the heavy ropes to the rings she had made him drive deep into the rock, and he tested each knot twice, and then a third time. He gathered the extra blankets she had stored, the extra rope, the shovels, the dried food, packed and ready, as though she had been packing it for this very day all along. Because in truth, she had. The trail down to the valley was useless now. It lay buried under many feet of snow, gone as though it had never been. There was only one way down, straight down the face of the cliff. Thad went first. He lowered himself slowly over the edge, hand over hand, down the frozen rock, until at last his boots touched the surface of the snow far below. And the snow held him. It was packed so deep, so dense, so hard by the endless wind, that a grown man could stand on top of it as though it were solid ground. He stood there on the roof of the buried world, and he looked up, and he called to her. "It holds," he called. "Come down." And the woman climbed down after him, down the cliff that everyone said no one could ever live on, down the rope tied to the rings that everyone had laughed at, down into the white and silent ruin of the valley that had cast her out. Her boots touched the snow. It held her too. And the two of them stood there together, on top of a buried town, beneath a brilliant and terrible sun, two small dark figures in an endless field of white. Then the woman began to walk toward the nearest chimney. They reached it. A thin, dark thing rising up out of the snow. The woman knelt down beside it. She put her face close to the dark opening, and she called down into it, into the cold and the dark below. "Hello," she called. "Is anyone there? Can you hear me?" For a long moment, there was nothing, only silence. Only the vast white silence of the buried world. And the woman's heart began to sink. She thought of how many days it had been, how long the people down there had been without wood, without air, without hope. She thought that perhaps she had come too late. And then, a voice, faint, weak, trembling, rising up from somewhere far below, through the dark of the chimney shaft. "Yes," the voice said. "Yes, we are here. We are alive. Please, please help us." The woman closed her eyes, and something broke open in her chest. Something warm, something fierce. "Hold on," she called down into the dark. "Do you hear me? Hold on. We are coming for you. We are coming." And then she took up her shovel, and she began to dig. They dug for hours. The woman and her husband side by side in the blinding sun, digging down through the packed and frozen snow toward the buried house, toward the trembling voice, toward the lives waiting in the dark. It was brutal work. The snow was hard as stone in places. Their arms burned. Their backs screamed. Their breath came in great clouds in the freezing air. But they did not stop. The woman who had once held only chalk and books, the woman with the calloused builder's hands, she dug as though her own life depended on it, as though every shovelful of snow she lifted was a word in that long, silent letter she had been writing all these years to a little girl who chased birds. "I could not save you," the digging seemed to say, "but I can save them. I can save them." And at last, after hours that felt like days, the shovel broke through. A passage opened, a dark mouth in the snow leading down into the buried house, and out of that darkness, blinking against the sudden brilliant light, came the people, a family, a man and his wife, and their two small children, pale and frozen and half-starved, weeping with a relief too deep for words. They climbed up out of their tomb and into the light, and they fell into the snow, and they wept, and they reached for the hands of the strangers who had pulled them back from death, the hands of the bird woman, the woman they had laughed at, the woman they had shunned. She gathered the children to her, wrapped them in the blankets she had carried down, and she held them. And she said the only thing there was to say. "You are safe now," she whispered. "You are safe." And then she stood, and she looked across the endless white, at all the other chimneys, all the other lonely dark markers rising up out of the snow. So many of them. So many lives still waiting in the dark. "Come," she said to Thad. "There are more." And they went on. For 3 days they did not rest. From chimney to chimney as they went across the frozen roof of the buried world, digging, calling, pulling soul after soul up out of the cold and the dark and into the light of the living. They led them, one family at a time, up the narrow rope to the cliff. to the swallow's nest, to the house that everyone had mocked, and the house that had been built for two somehow held them all. Family after family, they crowded into its warm stone chambers. They packed into its rooms, just as the ancient builders had once packed into the very first cliff homes, centuries before. Strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder in the warmth of the rock, children sleeping in rows on the floor that the winter sun had warmed. And the woman moved among them all. This was her hour. She rationed the food she had stored away while the town laughed at her hoarding. She melted snow for water. She tended the frostbitten and the sick. She wrapped the children in blankets and held the weeping and calmed the frightened. The teacher had become a builder, and now the builder had become something more. A keeper, a shelter, a still strong center in the middle of all that ruin. She did not sleep. She did not stop. She moved through the crowded rooms of her home like a quiet flame, and everywhere she touched, the cold drew back, and the fear eased, and the living found that they could breathe again. The home she had built to hold her grief was now overflowing with life. The childless woman, who the town had pitied for having no one to care for, had a house full of souls to care for now. Dozens of them, all of them depending on her, all of them alive because of her. And in the rare quiet moments, when she stood at the south window and looked out over the work that was still to be done, she would think of Wren, the little girl who chased birds. I built it for you, she thought, and look what it holds now. Look at all the life inside it. You are in every stone of this place, and every soul we save. We save with you, but not every soul could be saved. The mountain had taken its winter, and the mountain does not give everything back. There were chimneys they reached too late. There were dark passages they dug open only to find a silence that no calling could break. Houses where the wood had run out, or the air had run out, or the cold had simply crept in faster than hope could hold it back. And each time, the woman knelt in the snow above one of those silent houses, and she bowed her gray head, and she let the grief move through her. She did not turn away from it. She had learned, long ago, that grief is not to be turned away from. It is to be carried, honored, held. So she held them, the ones she could not save. She held them in her heart alongside the little girl who chased birds, and she made room, because the heart, she had learned, can always make more room than a person believes. And then she rose, and she wiped her eyes, and she went on to the next chimney, because the living still needed her, and the dead, she knew, would understand. On the fourth day, they came to the last of them. It was the place where the grand mansion had stood. There was almost nothing left to mark it now, only a single corner, a single buried room, where one last chimney rose up thin and dark out of the white. The woman knelt beside it. She called down into the dark, the way she had called 100 times now. "Hello? Is anyone there? Can you hear me?" And from somewhere far below, faint and broken, a voice answered. A man's voice, a voice she knew. "Here," it said. "We are here. Please, my children. Save my children." It was Gideon Marsh. The woman went very still. Here, beneath her, in the ruins of the great fortress he had built against his own fear, was the man who had named her the Cliff Swallow. The man who had laughed the loudest and the longest. The man who had placed his bets on how soon she would break. The man who had built 3 proud stories to keep the cold and the shame and the poverty away from himself forever. And now the cold had him. And the shame was gone, burned away in the dark. And there was nothing left of all his pride but a broken voice in a buried room, begging a poor woman to save his children. For one long moment, the woman knelt in the snow above him, and she did not move. She could have felt many things in that moment. Many of them would have been fair. But she felt only one thing. She felt the thing she had seen in his window on that golden autumn evening. The small, lost, frightened man, alone in the middle of everything he owned. She had pitied him then. She would save him now. "Hold on, Mr. Marsh," she called down, and her voice was steady and clear, and without a trace of anything but kindness. "Hold on. We are coming for you. All of you. Hold on." And she took up her shovel, and she began to dig. It was the hardest digging of them all. The snow was deepest here, at the head of the valley. The ruins were tangled and treacherous, the fallen timbers of the great house shifting under the weight of the white. More than once the passage threatened to collapse. More than once Thad pulled her back from the edge of danger. But she would not stop. She dug for the man who had mocked her, with the same fierce strength she had spent on the families who had been kind, perhaps more, because she understood now that the digging was not only for him, it was for her. To pull a man up out of darkness, even a man who had wronged you. That is a thing that frees the one who digs as much as the one who is buried. And at last, the shovel broke through. The dark passage opened, and from the ruins of his fortress, Gideon Marsh sent his children up first. 2 small faces, blinking in the brilliant light, and then a third. His wife, the polished Adelaide, her fine clothes filthy and torn, her cold pride utterly gone, weeping as she clung to the hands that pulled her free. And last of all, came Marsh himself. He climbed up out of the ruins, barely able to stand. His face was gray and frostbitten. His grand ambitions had been reduced to this: a man on his knees in the snow, alive only because of the woman he had spent years trying to break. He looked up. He saw who had saved him. He saw the gray hair, the calloused hands, the steady, kind eyes of the bird woman. And then he looked up, past her, to the cliff above, to the swallow's nest. It stood there in the brilliant sun, warm and whole, and utterly untouched. The smoke rising soft and golden from its chimney, the light glowing in its south window, the one house in all that drowned white world that the storm had not been able to break. The house he had laughed at, the house that had just saved his life, and the lives of his wife and his children, and dozens more besides. Gideon Marsh looked at it for a long, long time. And then the proud man, the rich man, the man who had never once in his life admitted that he was wrong about anything, began to weep. "I called it a nest," he whispered, his broken voice cracking in the cold. "I called you a fool. I called you a bird woman with nothing to show for her life." He looked at her, and his eyes were full of something she had never seen in them before: shame and wonder, and the beginnings of something that might one day become grace. "And your nest," he said, "your nest just kept us all alive." The woman looked down at the broken man kneeling in the snow. She did not gloat. She did not say, I told you so. She did not take the victory that was so completely, so perfectly hers. She simply reached down and offered him her hand, her calloused, ruined builder's hand, the hand that had carved a home out of solid rock, the hand that had torn itself open on the stone, season after season, the hand that had dug a dozen families out of the dark, the hand that had written a long and silent letter to a little girl who chased birds. She offered it to the man who had hurt her most. "Come, Mr. Marsh," she said gently. "Let us get your children somewhere warm." For a moment, he only stared at the offered hand, as though he could not believe it, as though, in all his life, no one had ever offered him a thing he had not paid for, or taken, or earned through fear. And then, slowly, with the last of his strength, Gideon Marsh reached up and took it, and the woman pulled him to his feet. And together, the bird woman and the broken rich man climbed the long rope up the face of the cliff to the warm and crowded house that had saved them all. That night, the swallow's nest glowed against the dark like a single ember in a field of ash. Inside, dozens of souls slept warm and safe in the heart of the ancient rock. The families who had laughed and the families who had wondered. The kind and the cruel. The poor young couple and the proud rich man. All of them now sleeping side by side on the warm stone floor. All of them alive. All of them kept by the mountain. And by the woman who had been wise enough to ask it. She did not sleep, even then. She moved among them in the firelight, pulling a blanket up over a child, pressing a cup of warm water into trembling hands, easing the fear from one more frightened face. And at last, near dawn, she came to stand at the south window. She looked out at the white and silent world, at the brilliant cold stars wheeling overhead, at the chimneys, fewer now, that still marked the buried valley below. She thought of all she had lost, and all she had saved. She thought of the little girl who chased birds, and for the first time in more years than she could count, the woman was at peace, not the quiet, sad peace of a wound grown old, but a deep and shining peace. The peace of a promise kept beyond anything she could have dreamed. She had set out so long ago to build something lasting, something that would shelter life long after she was gone. She had not known then how soon that shelter would be needed. She had not known how many lives that promise would hold. She pressed her hand against the cold glass that had once been her wedding ring. And out in the vast and silent dark, the mountain held them all. The snow did not give up the valley easily. It held on through the long cold weeks, white and silent and heavy, as though the mountain were reluctant to show the world what it had done. But spring always comes, even after the hardest winter, especially after the hardest winter. And slowly, so slowly, the white began to soften. The drifts sank. The chimneys, one by one, rose higher out of the melting snow. The buried street appeared again, dark and muddy beneath the thaw, and the survivors, sheltered all that time in the warm heart of the cliff, came down at last to see what was left of the world they had known. There was almost nothing. Every house in the valley had collapsed beneath the weight of the snow, or stood so broken and ruined that no one could ever live in it again. The fences were gone. The wagons were gone. The proud single street was a ribbon of mud and splinters. And the grand mansion at the head of the valley, the great fortress of imported timber and costly glass, was nothing now but a scatter of shattered wood, sinking into the slush. The people stood in the ruins of their town, and they did not know what to say. They had come west chasing silver. They had built their homes quickly, cheaply, certain that the next winter would be gentle, the way the last ones had been. And the mountain had shown them, in one long and terrible season, exactly how much their certainty was worth. A gathering was called, but there was no hall left to gather in, no church, no meeting house. Not a single roof in all the valley still stood whole. So they met where the only thing still standing could shelter them. They met at the foot of the cliff, in the shadow of the swallow's nest, in the shadow of the house that everyone had laughed at, and that had saved them all. They came together there, the whole of the surviving town, the poor and the proud, the kind and the cruel, the young couple who had once looked up at the warm window and wondered, the families pulled from the dark. They stood together in the mud and the melting snow, and they looked up at the dwelling in the cliff, and a great silence settled over them. And then a man stepped forward, Gideon Marsh. He was a changed man. Anyone could see it. The frostbite had left its mark on his face, and it was healing slowly. But that was not the change. The change was deeper. It was in his eyes. It was in the way he held himself now, without the old armor of pride. He stood before the gathered town, beneath the cliff, and when he spoke, his voice was rough and quiet and humble, in a way no one had ever heard it before. I have spent my whole life, he said, building monuments to myself. The town listened in silence. Grand houses, fine things, walls and windows and 3 proud stories, all of it meant to be admired. All of it meant to tell the world how far I had come, how much I had beaten, how little I had left to fear. He stopped. He looked down at his own hands. Then he looked up, at the dwelling in the cliff above them all. And in one winter, he said, the mountain took every bit of it. It crushed my house like it was nothing, like all my pride was nothing, because it was. His voice broke, but he went on. That woman up there. He turned and he looked toward Cora, who stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, beside her husband, as she always had. That woman and her husband built something different. They did not build to be admired. They did not build to beat anyone. They built something humble, something that worked with the mountain instead of against it. He swallowed hard, and when the mountain came down on all of us, her humble little nest was the only thing left standing. Her wisdom saved us when all my money could not buy a single life. He took a step toward her. The whole town watched. I mocked your home, he said, his voice thick now. I called it a swallow's nest, fit only for the birds. I called you a foolish old woman with nothing to show for her life. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. He stood before her, the proud man brought low, the rich man with nothing left but the truth. I have nothing left to offer you, he said, but my gratitude and my apology. They are not much, but they are yours, for whatever they are worth. And then the richest man in the valley bowed his head before the woman everyone had called a fool. A long silence followed, and then the woman stepped forward. She was not a large woman. She was gray now and weathered and tired from 3 days of digging souls out of the snow. But when she spoke, her voice carried across the whole silent gathering, clear and calm and strong. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "you owe me no apology." A stir went through the crowd. "We did not build our home to prove anyone wrong," she went on. "We did not build it for you or for any of you. We built it because it was the thing we were meant to build. And the stone does not care for opinions. The mountain does not remember insults." She looked around at the gathered faces, at the women who had drawn their skirts aside as she passed, at Adelaide Marsh, who had spoken the cruelest words of all, who now stood pale and humbled at the edge of the crowd, at the men who had laughed in the assay office and placed their bets on how soon she would break, at all of them. The people who had cast her out, the people she had pulled from the dark with her own 2 hands. "We are all alive," she said simply, "or most of us are. We grieve the ones we lost. We will grieve them all our days. But the rest of us are standing here in the spring, breathing the air. And that is what matters now. Not who laughed, not who was right, only that we are still here, together." She let that settle, and then she said the thing that would change the valley forever. "The town can be rebuilt," she said. "The only question is how." She lifted her gray head and looked out over the ruined valley. "We can build the way we built before, quickly, cheaply, hoping the next winter is gentle, hoping the mountain forgets what it just showed us." A pause. "Or we can learn." Her voice grew softer, and somehow that made everyone lean in to hear it. "We can build with the mountain, not on top of it, daring it to knock us down, but with it, as part of it, the way the old ones did, long before any of us came here. We can carve our homes into the rock that will never rot, never collapse, never fail. We can face them south to catch the winter sun. We can build homes that will shelter not just us, but our children, and our children's children, and the children of people we will never live to meet." The valley was utterly silent, and then her husband Thad stepped up beside her. He had never been a man of many words. He did not become one now. "I will teach anyone who wants to learn," he said simply. "The stone is patient. It will wait for us to understand it." And in that moment, something shifted in the valley. Not all at once. Great changes never come all at once. But a seed was planted. The same kind of seed the old wanderer's words had once planted in Cora's heart. A seed that would wait in the dark and then grow. The rebuilding took years, and the town that slowly rose from the melted snow was nothing like the town that had been buried. Under Thad's patient eye, new homes went into the cliff faces on both sides of the valley. Some were carved directly from the rock, just like the swallow's nest. Others were built against the cliff, using the solid stone as a back wall, with the natural overhangs forming their roofs. Every new home faced south to catch the low winter sun. Everyone used the heavy, patient stone to hold the warmth through the long nights. And every single one stood high above the valley floor, far above the deep snow that had so nearly killed them all. The people learned, family by family, stone by stone, and the woman moved among them, teaching, guiding, sharing what she knew. The teacher had her classroom again after all these years, only now her lessons were written in rock, and they would last 1,000 years. As for Gideon Marsh, he never rebuilt his grand mansion. He could have. He still had wealth enough, buried away. He could have raised another fortress of timber and glass, taller and prouder than before. He did not. Instead, he paid for something else, a great hall carved deep into the eastern cliff, a place strong enough and warm enough to shelter the whole town, all of them at once if a winter like that one ever came again. A place where no one would ever again be left to face the dark alone. And he did not simply pay for it. He built it with his own 2 hands. The richest man in the valley learned to cut stone and mix mortar, working alongside the men he had once looked down upon. His soft hands grew calloused. His proud back bent over the patient work. And somewhere in that labor, in the sweat and the dust, and the simple, honest weight of building something that would shelter others, Gideon Marsh found a thing his money had never once given him. He found peace. He would work beside the others all day, and in the evenings he would sit and look at what his hands had made, and there was a quiet in his face that had never been there before. The fear was gone. The thing he had spent his whole life building walls against had simply let go of him. He had lost his fortress, and in losing it, he had finally been set free. Now there was a thing the woman did near the very end of the rebuilding. A small thing, a quiet thing, but it was the thing that mattered most of all. When the swallow's nest had first been finished, all those years ago, there had been no words carved above its door, only bare and beautiful stone. But after that terrible winter, after all the saving and the grief and the slow rebuilding of the world, the woman asked her husband to carve something there, above the door, where every soul who came to that high home would see it. A few simple words. Thad carved them carefully, the way he carved everything, letter by patient letter, deep into the living rock, deep enough to weather 100 winters and 100 more. The words read, "The earth endures. Build with her." And the people who came to see the dwelling, in the years that followed, would sometimes pause before those words. And they would ask a question. Why her? Why not it? The earth was a thing, was it not? A thing of rock and soil. Why call it her? And the woman, when she was asked, would only smile a small and private smile. And she would say that the earth was not a thing to be conquered. It was a partner, to be respected, to be loved. And that was true. It was a good answer. It was the answer the town came to know. But it was not the whole truth, because the woman had another reason for that word, a reason she carried in the deepest part of her heart, and shared with no one but the man who had loved her through all of it. She thought of a little girl who had chased birds across a yard, in another life, in another time. A little girl named after a bird herself. A little girl who had slipped away one cold season, before the spring, and taken a part of her mother with her. Wren. The grief had never left. It never would. A mother does not stop being a mother, even when the child is gone. Especially when the child is gone. But here, at last, was what the woman had been searching for all those long years, a place to put the love. She had set out to build something lasting, something strong, something that would shelter life long after she was gone. And she had done it. She had built a home that had saved dozens of souls, a home that had taught a whole valley how to live, a home that would still be standing when every person now alive was dust, and every stone of it she had set with her daughter in her heart. Build with her, the word said. Build with the earth, yes, but also build with her, with the little girl, with the love that had nowhere to go until it went into the stone. Every wall raised was raised with her. Every life saved was saved with her. She was in every part of that house, woven into the rock itself, alive forever in the shelter it gave. The child the woman had lost had become, in the end, the home that kept a whole valley alive. That was the secret in the carving. That was the love hidden in a single small word. And only the woman and the man beside her ever truly understood it. The years went on, the way years do. The valley grew into something quiet and good, a place where homes were built with humility and with patience and with respect for the great mountain that held them. The young grew old, the old were laid to rest, and the swallow's nest watched over all of it from its high place in the cliff, its south window catching the morning light, year after year after year. And the woman grew old in it. She and her husband lived out their long days in the home their hands had made. They never had children of their own. That door had closed forever, long ago. But they had taught hundreds of others how to build homes that would last. And in a way, every one of those homes was a child of theirs. Every family sheltered by the cliff was, in some quiet sense, kept by the love of a woman who had lost her own little girl and turned her grief into stone, and her stone into shelter, and her shelter into life. When the end came for them, it came gently. They had been together so long and loved each other so deeply that it seemed the world could not bear to separate them by much. The man went first, one quiet winter, in the warm heart of the rock he had spent his life learning to love. And the woman followed him not many months after. She did not go in sorrow. She went the way a person goes to sleep after a long and good day's work, the way a person closes a book they have finished, and finished well. She lay down in the home they had built, in the shelter that had held so many lives, and she let go. And it is a gentle thing to imagine, though no one can know such things for certain, that somewhere, in whatever comes after, a little girl who once chased birds was waiting for her, and that the mother who had built a whole valley out of her love finally got to hold her again. The dwelling still stands. It stands there to this day, in the high cliff above the quiet valley, just as it has always stood. The wind has worn at it for more years than anyone can count. But the stone endures. The stone always endures. Its south window still catches the winter sun. The walls are still warm to the touch, holding the mountain's ancient heat the way they always have. And above the door, carved deep in patient stone, the words can still be read by anyone who climbs the narrow trail to find them. The earth endures. Build with her. People who visit sometimes feel something there. A quiet, a peace, a sense of being held. They cannot say what it is. They do not know about the woman who carved a home out of her grief. They do not know about the little girl named after a bird. They do not know about the love that went into the stone, the love that is in it still, holding up the walls, keeping the cold away, sheltering every soul who comes to rest beneath that ancient overhang. They do not know, but perhaps, in some quiet way, they feel it all the same, because love like that does not end. It does not collapse, or rot, or fail. It endures. the way the earth endures, the way the stone endures, the way a mother's love endures, long after the winter, long after the grief, long after the hands that built it have gone still. Build with her. And so she did, and so it stands, and so it will stand, long after all of us are gone.